you need and deserve the same support. You need to show up with your own vulnerability at times, because you have needs, you have emotional needs that need to be met. And it's really important for young men to understand and own their own emotional needs and not be ashamed or afraid.
I want to kick this off by just understanding Better Boys, Better Men didn't just come out of you having your first son at 2000 and 2011. It's really something that goes well beyond into your childhood and through your life. Can you give us a little guidance into what really drew you into this topic and excited you about something, or made you so passionate about it?
Absolutely, yeah. It's funny. I've never been excited about it, Scott. Never. I've
Okay.
never been excited about it. I've been driven to do it. And as you know, they're two different things. They're sometimes the same and sometimes they're different. But there were like a series of reckonings for me throughout my life. And the first one begins, and I'll try to keep it short, but it begins when I'm about 8 years old, and I get into this brutal fist fight with a neighborhood boy. And in my neighborhood, typically, you got into if you got into fist fights with another kid from the neighborhood, it was over really quickly, and you got back to doing what you were doing, which typically often we were playing some kind of sport outside. But this kid was a whole different breed entirely. And I realize now, looking back, that this was a family where there was always, kids in the neighborhood would often hear in the evenings a lot of screaming and yelling coming from their houses when the boys were inside. So my sense looking back is that there was probably at least a lot of verbal abuse, and I'm sure some trauma. But be that as it may, this little boy, Georgie, he was just a spitfire. I mean, he was tough. And we got into this fist fight, and I thought, no problem, it's going to be over in a couple minutes. But I mean, it really became this just this kind of brutal fight. And I remember at one point, he was telling me, get down on your knees and beg for mercy. So of course I did that. And he keeps pummeling me. I remember getting up and running away, and all the neighborhood kids by this point had gathered around. I remember, seeing everybody, in slow motion, kind of just everybody just watching with their mouths agape, because nobody got into fights like this in our neighborhood. And, he ends up tracking me down, and I had this kind of small out-of-body experience where I can kind of see down and see him hitting me. It was clearly very traumatizing. But that wasn't the only part of it. I come home at some point later that day, and I hear my oldest brother yelling. And I'm assuming, I thought, great, he's going to come to my aid, and he's probably really pissed off, and he wants to do something to help me out. He's yelling at our mother about what a coward I am and what a black sheep I am to the family, because he'd heard about the fight. And after that, it became really just kind of a smear campaign throughout my childhood, actually well into early adulthood, about always painting me out as a black sheep, as a coward, and this kind of thing. And the first reckoning for me was that when that happened, I wasn't conscious of it, but I realized that, I hated him for what he did, the way he reacted. And with time, I realized that I wanted to push back against everything he represented. And of course, as often happens when you're young, you don't do this in a conscious way, and you're certainly not doing it in a productive way. So I ended up getting into lots of fights. I kept trying to fight my way out of my shame, which I didn't know at the time. But I'm trying to fight my way out of my shame, and ultimately really trying to prove myself to him. But that really began kind of later on in late adolescence, me looking for ways to kind of push back against what he represented. And so for me, that represented an awareness, a growing awareness of so many different forms of this kind of masculinity that was being imposed on us, not just by the adults, but by each other as boys, that I just grew to hate. And so it would just kind of keep growing, as I got older, to the point where, I was trying to find ways to push back as much as I could against not just my brother, but lots of guys I encountered who kind of had this very typically hyper masculine, kind of ethos in all the ways that it presents itself that we know about. So fast forward about when I'm in my 20s and I'm on a flight with a girlfriend at the time. We're coming back from Lake Tahoe. We'd been out there with her family. And it had been a kind of a week, I think, for both of us where we realized it wasn't going to work out. We didn't have that conversation, but we both kind of knew deep down. And it was rough because, we were in love, but it was very, very much kind of a foreshadowing. And I'm reading this novel on the flight home that really kind of hit a nerve, and I'm getting to the end of it. And I just start sobbing, and I hadn't cried openly since I was probably about 11 years old, maybe 12 at the most. And I remember it was the first time in a long time that I'd really cried at all. And I just let it go. I didn't even try to stop it. And I wasn't sure why at the time. But I remember my girlfriend is sitting next to me. She, unclenches her hand from mine, moves her hand away. I noticed in the corner of my eye, she's just kind of looking out the window. There's a businessman next to me. He's just kind of looking straight ahead. He's like, white knuckling, he's just trying to like do everything he can not to look at this because it's
not
so
happening. It's not happening. This is not happening. That's
exactly. What is this guy next to me doing? When in God's earth? And everybody's, of course, is looking around. And this was a really small gesture on my own part for myself that I did, but for me, it became really important. I decided at that moment, I didn't know why, but I was not going to hide the tears. I was not only was I not going to hide them, but I wasn't going to wipe them away. And I didn't realize why at the time. But with time, I would start to realize that really, I was tired of hiding. I'd been pushing back for years in many ways, but I'd never made myself this openly vulnerable before. And I realized eventually after that flight that that's what that, not wanting to wipe away my tears was. Because, years earlier, I would have probably hid my face. I would have wiped away the tears, but I was not going to wipe away the tears this time. And that really kind of started to open things up for me as well. And then when my son is born, as you mentioned, in 2011, that was kind of a third reckoning, where now this pitched battle that I was always pushing, I was always willingly taking on to, push back against. I realized that I didn't want to make my baggage my son's. And it's not that there wasn't some value to what I was doing, but I didn't want to strap him, let alone as he became, was growing into a young boy, I didn't want to strap him with any unnecessary or unfair kind of perspectives or worldviews, about who he should be assuming he identified, as a male. And so that really was the third reckoning. And it was hard for me when I realized, as ecstatic as I was that my wife had given birth to what we, assumed was a son, it also really made me realize, like I said, a lot of these things that I had to rethink how I was going to navigate my own way with this idea of masculine identity, and then what it was going to mean for having a son now. Because honestly, it just, at that time, it would have felt a lot easier to me to have a daughter because I knew what that meant, having a son now, assuming again that he identified as male. And so that really kind of was the third reckoning. And it pushed me further along in what really became, as painful as it was to have to deal with a lot of these issues, kind of working backwards again, it was really important and really kind of solidified for me this idea that I had to re-examine a lot of my preconceived notions and my own stereotypes against boys and men. And so that kind of was the book for me, Scott, became a way of learning to reconnect with and find again greater context and compassion and empathy for boys and men that along the way that I had just lost.
Yeah, that's powerful. So your brother and your girlfriend in that moment, all I could think about is how your brother turning on you in that moment was a moment where you realized someone that you loved unconditionally was no longer, maybe didn't have your back, and it felt really, really bad. And then sitting in that plane seat, knowing that someone you had opened yourself up to was not going to be what you thought it was. Some of that can really come out at one time. You couple that with the right novel, and it obviously is a powerfully emotional moment. It's interesting the way that she handled it as well, is how a lot of women respond to that in the first place. And so one of the challenges with changing the terms when it comes to masculinity are how it's received by their partners and women. I mean, I have had this conversation many times where men will say, listen, my wife, my partner, she tells me constantly that I need to be more vulnerable, more authentic, more open. And then, a couple of times in my life, I have tried these things, and they say, and when I do, it seems to immediately backfire. It doesn't in the moment, but 2 weeks later, it's like, oh, are you going to cry now? Are you going to be weak now? Is this the new version of you? Like it's very instinct. There are some instinctual components here that are challenging. And so I'm interested in your insight there and what you've learned through this study, because I feel like you lived this, you went through this exact situation and you saw the response. How do you teach or talk through these issues with young men today, or at least in the open?
It's, this is something that really, I'm so glad you brought this up, Scott, because this really is a pet topic of mine, because there's just two things I want to say before I get to answer your question, if that's okay for context. When you look on social media and you see a lot of women posting about their relationships, and when you see articles and headlines, in Vogue and Cosmo, in your news feed, and you see, and a lot of women focused kind of publications, Women's Health, whatever, there's always these articles about the ways that men refuse to show up with vulnerability. And it drives me crazy. And I'm using restraint here, Scott.
Yeah.
There's a lot more I'd like to say about this. It drives me crazy because there are so many men, especially, and it's not that there aren't older men who do this, but there are so many younger men, especially, who show up this way, and they get there's often forms of gaslighting that they're met with. There's, as you said, there's different forms of rejection, and that never gets out there. I had to, one of the last pieces I did for this editor I was working with at the New York Times was a piece about this, was about that there are men out there that want this, and that you're spot on, when they learn how, often with the help of therapists, when they learn how to get in touch with their emotions, when they learn to say, okay, I'm going to present this to this woman in my life who's been asking me and pleading with me to be more vulnerable. When they do, often the first time, and you're right, often the first time, it's received with, the kind of reception that they hope for. But then over time, there is a lot of open, very hurtful rejection. And a lot of that comes from, girls who want men to be just like their dads. They want them to be, just like the fathers that they love, out of these Hallmark movies, and these are rarely men who are showing up with emotional honesty, with the courage to be emotionally honest and vulnerable. And so it's, there is so much that is unspoken that needs to be spoken. And a lot of men won't push for this because of the shame of it, and because they're afraid of, how they're going to be perceived. And so this is a real important topic, for me. This is something that I've said, and I've worked with my son, even though he's now 12 years old, car rides to school, sometimes we have wonderful conversations. And some of the things I've said to him sometimes are, look, I know I'm going to have to keep repeating this to you, but it's going to be really important that you find somebody who is worthy of you. You find somebody who, I know you, and I know that you're going to encourage this person. You're going to nurture and nourish this person emotionally and be affectionate with this partner, but you deserve the same thing every bit as much as you give. in my own marriage. I'm sure my wife, wouldn't love for me to talk about this, but I've told her before. I said, there are times I need to talk about this. I told her from the get-go when we met, that I wanted deeper intimacy with whoever I was, going to eventually wind up with. And that meant vulnerability. I knew that by that point. She knew that intellectually, and she was on board with it. But what it looks like in real time, man, whole different ballgame. There have been so many times, and she's gotten, to her credit, a lot better, with a lot of work together, and sometimes with a couples counselor. But she's really gotten a lot better. But for a long time, there were a lot of these hangups that she struggled with. And she's a proud feminist. She is, she's a social, she always used to consider herself a social justice warrior, all these very open-minded perspectives. But when it came to men and what the expectations should be of what a man, should be, I had to push back a lot, and I still do at times, because I've learned to create my own boundaries, and we need to do that as men. We need to have our own needs met, and we need to let people know, especially if we're straight, the women in our lives, we need to let them know when they've trespassed, and that we also need to let them know when our needs need to be met as well as theirs. And so, when we talk about what we should be talking about with young men, these are the kinds of things we should be talking about with them. We should be saying to them that you're going to be in relationships, hopefully. And, if you're a sensitive, empathic person at all, you will want to give your partner what he or she needs. And that said, you need and deserve the same support. You need to show up with your own vulnerability at times, because you have needs, you have emotional needs that need to be met. And it's really important for young men to understand and own their own emotional needs and not be ashamed or afraid of them.
How do you think it's impacted over the course of time? I mean, ultimately, your brother displayed what most men feel and say in a frustrating or emotional time. So it's very normal for a man to respond emotionally with anger and frustration when they don't know how to communicate. That's how they communicate, and it's not all positive, of course, but at the same time, you have generations and generations. It's interesting to me that I always say, I grew up in a time, I'm 45 years old. When I got married in my 20s, I was blown away that my role had completely changed and nobody told me about it. And so what I mean by that is that I grew up with grandfathers and a father and a good family unit. But dad was the dominant. Dad was the man. What dad said was the strength, and he didn't change diapers, and he didn't, do all the extra stuff. He didn't cook, he didn't clean, he didn't pick. By the way, my dad does all these things now. We all change and alter and build in our relationships, much like you're describing your wife, right? Everybody changes to match the partner. In a healthy marriage or partnership in general, you are willing to adjust and alter as you need to. But I remember being that what I call that first generation, where the rules had changed and our spouses demanded us to be equal partners. And so I was feeding the baby when we had our son the first time, and I took him to daycare the first time and had to drive him in. And I remember how tough that was to drop him off, and we both worked. And we still had roles and defined roles, but I remember kind of waking up and saying, this is really different. And then sitting at I'll kind of round this thought out by saying, sitting with my wife's family and a bunch of her uncles one Easter, we're all sitting around and they're talking about raising kids and how much they did. And I laughed and I said, you guys didn't do anything. You screwed it up for all of us because you guys were so bad at helping out that my generation woke up and had to do. We went from 0 to 50% of the load. And sometimes that means 50% of the load, plus we still needed to be the providers and the protectors and the things that were demanded upon us. And so I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that it was a awakening and a change that took getting used to. So when we're talking to men from generations and generations of the same thing, and they find themselves in a new environment, in a new world, how are we guiding them into this next chapter? And if you have any conversation points on the topic, I'm open to any of that, because I find it extremely interesting.
It is. And I'm so glad you shared your own experience, because as I'm listening to you, for me, the burning question is, I would love to hear how it felt, if you can remember, to have to go, like you said, which is exactly the way I would describe it, from 0 to 60 on a dime, without having any modeling of this or any preparation. There's all this expectation, and in no uncertain terms. This is what I, as your wife, expect and demand of you, and you better be, the good man and live up to this. And that's all well and good, but the problem is that when you suddenly have to hit these new expectations, it's not just a physical expectation of doing more. There's a mental, emotional, and spiritual component to this. And that's something that I feel like, that really a lot of men don't talk about, because A, they're not aware of it, and B, again, they're just afraid that, if they talk about these kinds of things, beyond just the physical exhaustion, they're going to be met with judgment. They're going to be met with ridicule. And they're going to, look like they're not doing what they should be doing as men and as fathers. But I would love to hear, Scott, if you remember, what it felt like to suddenly have to turn on a dime and change, really the paradigm. Do you remember what that felt like? I'm talking about emotion.
Yeah. What's interesting is I can give you the feeling as I was going through it, as well as the interesting dynamic of having 2 teenage sons and one approaching, adulthood. There are things that I couldn't get my head around. I mean, I didn't, when we first got married, the only thing we probably argued about was I worked late and she was a teacher. So she was home and she would wait to cook dinner until we both were there. And I remember going, wait a second, I don't care. Let's just eat dinner. When I get home, let's eat dinner. And my mom's an Italian mom. She was a paralegal, still is, works, enormous amounts of hours, did 100% of the work at home, as well as was a working mother in the 80s. And so she was a superhero. So I kind of got an expectation that was probably not fair. And my dad was what I call first generation father. He had he had a rougher upbringing, and his dad was engaged and involved, but in some tougher ways. And so my dad was involved in loyalty. He was there, he worked, he showed up, and that was 100% more than anybody had ever done in his life. So to bring this back to the point that you asked, I felt extremely frustrated. And so there were lots of things that, instead of enjoying the journey as much as I probably could have and should have, I remember being frustrated that I'm feeding my son in the morning, and I have so much I have to get done before I go to work, and I'm holding him. And then I would find myself going, this isn't all that bad. And you're really battling through something that you didn't expect. And so, and being young and kind of, again, I was in my 20s, so I wasn't extremely evolved. I'm
Right.
still growing up, and I was pretty alpha. I mean, the other side is I kind of was, I was going through my own version of figuring out how to manage what I felt. And to this day, if my boys get injured, I'm a mess. I mean, and I'm not a mess. I'm not a vulnerable mess, but I definitely immediately will get frustrated. I will, I'll be like, why did you do that? What do we like? I go old school instead of new school very, very quickly. And And there's a lot of things that we've evolved to be better at. But in that moment, I can remember just battling with, is this supposed to be this way? Am I being scammed? Is this what we signed up for? And to fast forward to the future, I remember the feeling of taking my second son to the babysitters and how prepared I was, how much I loved being home every time, you know, when they were sick or we would go out and get a special meal at lunch. My job, my wife's job was a teacher. My job allowed me, my career allowed me to have a lot of these moments. I went to every school function, every one of them. I mean, I did everything, things that I did not feel were my role when I started fatherhood. And I coached soccer. I did all the things that I wanted to do. And then I did a lot of things I hadn't signed up for in my brain. But all of it is something that I'm grateful for today. So none of it is something that, you know, it has even given me a better appreciation for my father. And so as we grow up, you know, there are lots of times where recently there's been a lot of travel, a lot of changes, a lot of challenges that are positive in our family. But one of our kids, his youngest son, is living away and playing soccer for Major League Soccer Academy. And so I'm on the road a lot. And my dad pulled me aside the other day, put his arm around me and was like, hey, I see what you're doing. It's a lot. And wow. You know what? I'm really proud of what you're doing. There's nothing that your boys could ever ask for more than this. And so for my father, that's a super big change. And so I guess the point is I'm answering the question, but I wanted to give some context because it's an interesting dynamic because this is an evolving topic. There's no perfect answer. You're not going to go from the alpha male that you grew up to be to immediately feeling the best and vulnerable and being a softer dad than you maybe thought you would be. But the payoff when you open up and you give all of yourself is real and authentic. And that's what the boys, in my opinion, what I wanted my boys to know is the imperfect side of their father, because all of us are imperfect. There's no perfect version. So they see the good parts and they see the challenges, and then we make mistakes. We talk about it. And they'll be better than I will be. And that's the goal, right? That's the one cool thing about better boys and better men. And Frederick Douglass said, and you probably have the quote, but it's better to build strong boys than to repair broken men. It's one of my favorite quotes. Absolutely. And it's because that's what each generation is really trying to do.
That's right. That's right. You know, I really feel that, you know, this idea of the American dream and, you know, and, you know, which has always been, of course, you know, that it's always been about, you know, economic security and economic, not just security, but, you know, having, you know, accruing more and more wealth, you know, having more and more things. I've never thought that that's what it's about. It's what I think that you're talking about. It's the idea of having children. And in this case, we're talking about boys. Having boys, and it's especially important for them, as I write about in the book, and I've been writing about more and more in a lot of articles I've been doing, it's especially more important for boys more now than even the girls, because girls are running laps around boys on every metric of success. And you're talking about from elementary school all the way through graduate school. The research is all there. Boys are really at a crossroads. And it's more important now than ever. I really am convinced of the more research I do and the more research I come across as I write about this, which is that really the legacy really is not about, it shouldn't be about the wealth. It's great if we can do that, but it's more important that we raise boys, as you're saying, to be even better than we were, and to be more integrated and to be more well-adjusted. And that integration is no small thing. You know, it's about learning to integrate and know that they have the permission, which all boys and men need is permission, to be fully integrated emotionally and to know that this really is one of their superpowers. This is a strength. It always has been, always will be a strength. Women understand that. Women know it's a strength because they have permission to do that, as well they should. And they're great because of that at building support networks around these, you know, the emotional parts of their lives and each other's lives. And this is really, for my money, is the next frontier for, for boys and men, learning how to create these different kinds of support networks that we're not used to creating for each other. And this is one way that we get our sons there.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually think the podcast is a way to do this. And so one of the things that I think is interesting is I have a lot of listeners and friends that listen, that will send me a text or reach out to me after a conversation, and they'll say, wow, that was really powerful to learn, or to hear that perspective, or, just to have validation that some of the things that I'm doing are working. I think fatherhood is a really interesting dynamic in that you will be, on average, a father is their son's hero until they're about the age of your son. And then they start to adjust. And part of the natural progression is they start to separate a little bit to create that I can fly on my own mentality. And in doing so, they start to push dad away. And maybe they bring mom a little closer. Maybe they push both of you away, which is not always the best thing. But the objective is that there's the home that they have to fall back on. And looking back on life, you get to about 23 to 25 years old as a man, and you start to say, maybe my dad wasn't all that bad. Maybe my dad was looking out for me. Maybe these things, maybe the discipline that he was teaching me actually provided me structure so I'd be more successful in life and these other boundaries. And then you have your first son and you have a different perspective, and it's even more positive. And you're like, wow, the emptiness my dad must have been feeling as I was leaving, and I was such a big part of their life, whether we knew it or not, is very, very powerful. And this changeover and these types of conversations are what get people to think about these things, so that they're at least visiting them with their friends, talking about them with other groups. And sometimes it's just having some friends that are close enough to you to talk about the real stuff, and you're not afraid to say the wrong thing. That's
exactly right. Exactly. And I think that this is the kind of conversation you and I are having right now around fatherhood is something a lot of men could sorely benefit from, is having these kinds of very real, very honest conversations about what it means to be a father, and what not just what the joys are, because a lot of men often want to go to that place of humor and levity, which is fine and it's in its place, or just kind of talking about all the great things, but because we don't feel that we should be talking about the difficult things, and that's one of the things we need. And that's what I was talking about earlier about, we need to learn how to create these support networks that women are so great at doing, because they cover all of their needs. And we need to have these conversations, especially as fathers.
Yeah, I think it goes even deeper too, in the sense that it's the reason why women often don't remarry. So when men and women, the numbers are staggering. Like 87% of men die married, and the numbers are like 61% or 59% of women. I don't know the exact numbers, but I know that they're similar. And the reason is, and I've been in the financial services industry for 21 years. I've helped widows and people in their finances for decades now. And I can tell you that in this world, the women have networks that are extensive. They have depth with their family. They have depth with their friends. They move into a new neighborhood. They become completely engulfed into the new neighborhood. Men have no one. And so they have their friends through their spouses. Most of their friends they had were from their earlier life.
That's exactly right.
And they've had to separate from them because maybe their friends didn't have kids at the same time, or maybe they were at a different stage, or so you keep changing your friends, and they're not as good at adapting. So their community becomes really shallow, and they feel very alone when they lose their spouse, and they have to fill that gap, and the gap's too big to fill it with the community, because they haven't built the depth they need outside of their spouse a lot of times.
That's exactly right. One of the things I do every semester when I teach the masculinity course is I'll have students go and ask if they have fathers, or if they don't have fathers, maybe uncles or grandfathers, but really just ask them one simple question: who do you turn to you probably can see where this is going. Who do you turn to when you really want to open up emotionally? Typically there'll be of maybe 15 students in the class, one or two of them will have, maybe a father who says, I don't really go to anybody. Most of them, I would say, typically it's about between 80 and 90% will say, I talk to your mother. Or sometimes the fathers will even say, sometimes I'll talk to my mother, and if these are college-age daughters, and sometimes the fathers will quite often say, I talk to you. And sometimes the daughters didn't even realize it. How is that? How is that for a shocker? Sometimes the daughters didn't realize it. But this is what we're talking about, is that, men are still, it's a one-trick pony. Too many men are still thinking, well, I can just, as long as I've got this, I'm good. As long as I've got this one person in my life that I can really talk to, my partner, my wife, maybe even their young adult daughter. They don't do it with their sons. Rarely. In 2 or 3 semesters, when I've asked students to do this, I've had only 1 or 2 fathers. One father, what am I saying? One father who said that, he talks with his son. One. And so, what this really speaks to is this idea of, that men really put, it's always out of fear. It's out of fear, and it's out of, a lack of awareness that they're putting all their eggs in that one basket. And one of the things that's happening is that more and more, as more and more older couples are getting divorced, and what's often happening is it's at the urgence of the woman. It's at the urgence of the wife. More and more, baby boomer couples are getting divorced, and it's at the woman is the one who wants this. And so, as you said, they go back out into the world, they are loving life, because they've got these husbands, often these old school husbands who were always asking too much of them anyway. And because there wasn't enough parity in the relationship, well, part of it is on them, because, maybe they should have, had more, made it much clearer, or made it, that must have been part of the partnership. There has to be more balance. It's both people, not just one. And so there's all these articles about this now. They're getting out of relationships. They feel like they have this brand new lease on life, and they have all of these wonderful networks that they're part of. And women now, much more than men, also have, business and entrepreneurial networks, right? I'm sure you know about that.
Yeah,
and so
sure.
they're doing a fantastic job with that. They have networks in, like you said, in every part of their lives, and they're working it brilliantly to their advantage. And then you've got these men who basically have the rug pulled out, and shockingly, they can't understand why. And then in midlife or a little bit older, they're suddenly alone. And so, these are the kind of guys that they never rebound. They never rebound. And the few that do, end up finding new ways of reconnecting, which really is like a paradigm shift for them. And it takes them so long, and it's so painful. And, this is happening more and more with women. And not only that, but more and more younger women don't even want to marry. They just want to be with their friends. They want to work. They want to have their jobs. They want to, have these, if they're lucky enough to have these great jobs, and they've got, wonderful work that keep them fully engaged. They want to have a dog, and they want to go on these great girls' night out and vacations with their girlfriends.
Yeah. And it can be challenging, and that's great too when you're young. But the other challenge is, as we get older, what I know is that the grandchildren and the next generation, that legacy that you get to see, if everything we have is about our families, right? And all of it's so powerful, it's very difficult for me to sit at it's difficult for me to think about not sitting at a Sunday dinner with my family, which we do every week. My mom, my dad, my siblings, we do this every Sunday, and it's very authentic. I mean, we have good conversations, we have arguments, we have disagreements, we have, in an Italian Catholic family, you're gonna argue about something, and the next week it's completely gone. You don't know anything about it. And but there's that next generation that's watching and learning. And the biggest challenge that we see today, one of the other things I just wanted to bring up briefly, is you know, the challenge we have with more and more single mothers raising young boys today without the father's example. And one of the things that I think is very powerful is that seeing a father, seeing a man, and learning from them directly is different than learning what one might look like. And this is a big challenge. And I have two nieces. I have a single mother sister with two nieces that I've been a major part of. Actually, I went on a nice date last night with my niece. We had a nice dinner, and she's at college here, so it's super great. And I've gotten to see them grow up and be a part of it. But sometimes I have to reshape their version of what men have been like in their lives, because it hasn't been as positive. And then now we have a young nephew who's growing up, and I think he's a phenomenal little guy. But sometimes there's a challenge between watching us do things and then them trying to do all the roles together. And it's really there's a lot more single mothers today than there ever were before. And so I see this as another challenge, to your point, is that I think those young men are actually growing up maybe a little more vulnerable, a little more authentic, but they're missing the way of balancing it that their dad or their uncle or their male figure might have shown them in that healthy setting. Maybe how you're showing your son, or maybe how I am trying to show mine. You know, you're trying to do the best you can is really what it comes down to.
Of course, absolutely. And you're absolutely right, Scott. I mean, the numbers of single mothers are just continue to rise. And, you know, there really is, there really is increasingly, and a lot of young men pick up on this feeling that they're starting to feel to some extent obsolete, you know, that they really don't know, you know, they honestly do not know. And it's very real what their place is, you know, what their direction is, because they do see that a lot of successful, you know, girls and young women are doing very fine, thank you very much, you know, without them. And there isn't this burning need for a lot of them to necessarily feel that, you know, I have to partner up, you know, with a man. And part of that is, that's part of the reason, not the only reason, but part of the reason for increasingly more single mothers. And, you know, and that clearly is going to send a message, you know, to all kids about, you know, about what this means about men, if there really aren't men in their lives, you know. And it's not surprising. There's been a spate of studies coming out, you know, over the past 5 years, talking about the, you know, the benefits to children of when fathers are engaged in their lives. And, you know, it goes from, especially for boys, self-worth, self-esteem, it gets into cognitive development, and that has nothing, you know, that's regardless of gender. It's cognitive development, you know, less anxiety, less depression, more well-being. So the presence of fathers is very important. There's no question about it. And I really do think that we really are kind of at a place culturally where we very much more and more are at this place of this atomization of the idea of a family, and not even just the atomization where it's breaking down, but just the feeling that you know, it's no longer necessary. You know, it's not just that it's breaking down, but there's more and more of a sensibility that, you know, and I feel like a lot of women feel this way, especially, that, you know, they realize they don't necessarily need men to do that. And it's true, they don't. It's absolutely true, they don't. And they're living proof of it. But I think it's especially difficult for the children, you know, for all the reasons we're talking about.
Well,
it really does send a message too about what value men bring to the table in life as well.
Yeah, to that point, they don't need it, but the kids do. And this
Absolutely.
is the challenge, is that's the delineating fact right there, is that they don't. And it's funny because there's this trend, and it's you live it and you see it, right? You see it in your own families, you see it in your friends, you see it in, again, work with widows for 22 years, and you will see this. And here's the trend. When you're young, you are the most important person to your spouse, to your wife as a man. as you age, you become less and less important. As the child rearing years are over, their community gets larger. Nowadays their success is greater. All the things that used to be a different world, a different realm, have changed. And so it goes right back to the baby boomers divorcing at a higher rate. It goes back to the fact that women aren't marrying after they've had kids. They've established the family. Your need becomes less and less. And so as a man, one of the challenges as you develop the support groups, as you talk about raising strong boys and building them into strong men, one of the challenges is the one thing that you thought you had figured out for a lot of these men is that you are their person. You are the man. And all of a sudden that starts to depreciate. It's like General Electric stock. Like GE is a company that at one time, Jack Welch and all those guys, that was like the greatest company. They were the Apple. They were innovators. They were a technology company and an industrial company. And today, Apple is the industrial company. It's the technology company. They do everything. And GE is like, well, it's a good company. It's a good company. It's always going to be there. But people are like, I don't know if I want to invest in it. And I use that analogy strictly because I feel like that's another challenge, is that you have a generation where a lot of men are going through trying to find their value after they thought what it was is no longer it. And that's a big topic.
It's a huge topic because it's too little too late. And so, and here's the thing about that. And I think it's too early to really know the answer to this, Scott, but I think that, one of the questions in my mind is, even if men, have all along kept up with their partners in terms of, of being co-parenting and being evolving partners in the relationship, is that still enough? I like to think it is. I hope it is. But I do wonder because you do see so many more baby boomer women divorcing. I mean, it's between like 75 and 80% of all divorces are initiated by women. And I mean, that's clearly, there's obviously something there. And so I do wonder, if it would make a difference, maybe not so much with the baby boomer generation, but maybe with, Gen X, millennials. I do wonder if keeping step with your partner and growing in ways, still would be enough. Again, I like to think that it would be. I think it's a little bit early to actually even know the answer to that.
Yeah. All I can hope is that it's an ebb and a flow. I've been married 20 years, will be 21 years in this coming year in May. And all I can say is that if I went into this relationship the same way that I did at 20, at 40, it would not be successful. And so I think what we have to understand is in every relationship, it's not just about, there's no generalized evolving. The generalized evolving is a point that could be a discussion point for lots of people to discuss, but evolving in your relationship is what's so important. Evolving in your role, in being able, as my mom still worked and my dad retired, my dad took on all the cooking, all the cleaning, he started doing all the things he never did. And to watch that change and that evolve, him evolve in that way was a great example to me and to our family, in that it's something we didn't always assume would happen. But when you love someone and you're building that relationship, that's also one of the best things you can ever do as a father or as a parent, is just doing the right thing. It's not just about saying the right thing or knowing the right thing. It's about showing how to do it, to model it. And hopefully we'll see, and it is too soon to see with the generational changes, and with women having children so much later now, into their 30s versus into their 20s, which is a substantial difference. There's career establishments. There's the pull and push and pull between, should I be at work? Should I be at home? It is a major challenge. And hopefully we don't lose too many young men along the way, and hopefully books and conversations like this can really be an outreach to help more men feel adjusted?
I sure hope so, because one of the things that so many men are missing is that, we so often feel that there's all these things that we need to show up as, as fathers and as husbands. There's all these things that we need to do, and it's often, at our own expense. It's often this feeling of lots and lots of sacrifice. And it's not that mothers do, because God knows they do. But with men, what they do is they feel that it's got to be all consuming. There's no boundaries. There are no boundaries for men. They feel that they're not showing up the way that they should as men, if they're not letting that boundary be completely porous with all the demands and expectations. They shouldn't complain. They should always show up and always give of themselves. And it's not that they shouldn't give of themselves, but men also need to learn that it is not unmanly, and you're not falling short as a man if you have needs, deeper needs, that you are also working hard to get them met as well. And that's what I was talking about earlier. Men do have deeper emotional needs. We just don't like to own up to it or admit it, because we feel that in some way we're falling short if we have emotional needs that need to be met. And the more that we distance ourselves from our emotional lives, the more that we present ourselves as not thinking of ourselves as emotional beings. And when we do that, not only do we send that message to our children, it's a profound message to send, to young girls. It's that, guys really aren't emotional beings, whether they consciously know it or not. And to boys, it's that this is not who I'm supposed to grow up to be. I'm not supposed to grow up to be somebody who has emotional needs. And if men could meet the needs, if they're in a family unit, meet the needs of their families, and also learn to accept that their needs are every bit as important, and that they ultimately serve them and their family, there would be more to work with for themselves if that rug is ever pulled out and they are left alone. There wouldn't be this giant hole in their gut. That would be filled. They would have a clearer sense of who they are, and they would know that, that while this marriage was, extremely important, it's no longer there, and they're going to be okay, that they can still find their way with having different support systems.
Yeah, I think we're very familiar in society with the woman and the mother that have given all themselves and there's nothing left. What we don't talk about, and those are great women, but we don't talk about are the great men.
Yeah.
That have done the same thing and have been so unselfish that they haven't even identified who they are and what they need. And I think that's exactly what you're discussing here. Is you're talking about the self-awareness that a lot of men don't dive. They go right into work. They go right into family. They go right into provide. And they spent zero time identifying who they are, what's important to them, why they're doing it. And then they wake up, and that's where the midlife crisis came from the 40 to 50-year-old man. It was, hey, I finally figured it out. I want stuff, or whatever it is that they go through, or they have an extramarital affair, or they do something that's not like them, but it's because they didn't even know who they were through the journey. The closer they are to figuring out who they are, and actually spending time, that again, I go back to love, impact, faith, and energy. If you're looking at who's most important and what your impact is, not just what you do every day, and your faith, something outside of yourself and how you're showing up, there's this imbalance of life that goes in all these different directions. But it's nice to have, if more men were finding that earlier and really identifying that, they'd be able to have better conversations, deeper conversations, and probably be more authentic and vulnerable in the relationship.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they would. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because when there's an acceptance of and an owning of that vulnerability, there's going to be authenticity. You can't separate the two. There's going to be authenticity, and you're right. It's going to make for more depth in life. Conversations, absolutely, but just in life. One of the problems with so many men is it's not just that, and women are like this now too. It's not just that their jobs are where they get their affirmation. It's when they can just endlessly give to their family. But when those children get up and leave, and then potentially your wife does as well, where's your affirmation, right? Where is your sense of self? And so, it's so important to do that. I was recently texting with a very, very old friend of mine, and I asked him, what he was going to do for his birthday. And he said, oh, same thing every year. Ever since my kids were little, I say, just give me a card. That's all I want is just give me a card. And I thought, nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I know him, and I know that, that is all he wants, because it's just about, that as long as I'm giving to them and I'm doing for them, that's all that I need. And there's nothing wrong with doing that, with giving, as long as you also are getting when you do have needs. And I know that if his wife were to leave him tomorrow, and his kids are now growing up and they're away, I know exactly, knowing who he is, what that trajectory would look like, and it would not be pretty.
Yeah, well, you usually know where mom stands. At the end of the day, if you asked any of the college students that you're dealing with on a day in and day basis what their mom needs to feel love, they can give it to you in 5 seconds. I can tell you right now, I need to have a meal with my mom. I need to let her cook for me. I need to be in the home. I need to visit her. We need to have a communication that's one-on-one. We need to be around our family. I have to support her in different ways. I could tell you all those things. It's not easy to tell you about fathers because they don't make it evident.
That's exactly right, Scott. Men, and I don't care how kind of trite or weird this might sound, but men really do need to know what their own love language is, because women do know it. And that really is an important thing, because that's about what are your needs as an emotional being. Men need to know that, because then they would feel much more fulfilled. And, and look, there are a lot of men out there who understandably, because they don't get their needs met, are resentful deep down a lot of the time. And if they could get those needs met, they'd be a hell of a lot less resentful.
Well, as the generation, so I can, maybe we can end here, but as the world changed, we talked about, I woke up and all the roles had changed and everything had been completely different and flipped upside down, and the role of husband and wife and spouses and partners had changed, right? So maybe it's still new enough that the other part of this is that the way fathers have always said, what your mother needs. I only need a card, but you know what mom needs? Mom needs a dinner out. Mom needs us to take her and do this. Mom needs this. Everything has been about dad a lot of times, not all the time, but when they knew mom needed something, it was about supporting them. Maybe we'll see moms and women starting to support what father, husband, spouse needs in the same way, where I could tell you right now, I think my wife would tell my boys, hey, your dad loves watching you play soccer. He loves being there. Talk about it with him. She'll tell them little things that just make me feel good. I just want to know where you're at in life. I just want to be able to help you. I want to give you some of the guidance that I've built in my brain and failed at. And we want to share that with you. That's all we want to do. We want to coach and teach and build. And so every time you get a chance to do that, you feel fulfilled. So if mom's out there kind of rallying for you a little bit, that can help. And I think that's part of our partnership. And the more we talk and communicate, the more we're supporting each other, not only in our relationship, but with the relationships of the next generation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I know it would be hard for a lot of men to do this, but they would do themselves and ultimately their families and their relationship a world of good if they would say to their partner or their wives, to be honest with you, this is something that's really important to me. Is it something that, that either with our children or with you, that maybe once in a while I could get this need fulfilled? Something as small as that, I know would be hard for a lot of men, but if they could get to the point that they would do that, they would be breaking down a really big wall that would benefit not just themselves, but everybody in their orbit so much more.
Yeah, Andrew, it's been an honor to have you on the show. It's been a lot of fun talking masculinity, better boys, better men. Here's the book. You can get it anywhere. Where else can they find you? Where else can our listeners get more of your conversations and look for your next publications?
Sure. So I have a lot of, if you just Google, there's a lot of pieces I've done. Like you said, in the past, the New York Times, a lot of pieces for the Post. I've been doing pieces for NBC Think, been doing a lot of op-eds. Baltimore Sun. I just had a piece in the Boston Globe. My website, andrewreinerauthor.com. And I got off of Twitter, X. So I'm only on Instagram now. I'm not really doing Facebook, but I'm on Instagram. Andrew.Reiner author, I think it is. I'm on Instagram, so you could also find me there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today, and look forward to seeing all the things that come in the future.
Thank you, Scott. It's been great talking with you.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you liked it, there's more where this one came from. Click here and enjoy some more.